Hello, today is May 15th, 2025. I'm meeting today with Mr. James Ling at his home in Fort Collins, Colorado. My name is Brad Hoops. I'm the interviewer of Remember and Honor, and we're here to capture James's life story with emphasis on his military career. So, welcome, Jim, and thanks for sitting down to tell your story today.
My pleasure.
I've long wanted to interview you. You've got, I know a little of your stories, so I'm anxious to get this down on video. Let's start out, if we could. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your date of birth, where you're born, a little bit about your family.
Okay, I was born in China, in Hankou, China, in October 1930, and lived over there for until the end of the war in the Pacific. And my parents were, I was of mixed parentage. My mother was Caucasian, my father was Chinese, and she gave up a lot to marry him. The thing is, back in the day, in 1928, when she got married, she'd lived here all her life, but the Chinese Exclusion Act was still on, and so she gave up her citizenship to marry him.
Really?
Yeah, that was in those days. That was a law, you know, and it wasn't repealed until I think the early 40s or thereabouts. But
Wow.
a lot of people don't know that, you know.
Now, how did they meet? How did...
Well, she was executive secretary for the American Electrochemical Society, which was headquartered in Columbia University, and they periodically they would have picnics with foreign students and stuff like that, and that's how she met him. She was at a picnic, and her roommate thought that this one girl was making too much of a play for my father, so she asked my mother if she would work her way in, and so she did, and then in the end...
So he was over here as a student?
He had gotten his PhD at Cornell.
Oh, wow.
And he was working at that time at a paint factory in New York City, and living at the International House. And so that's how they met. And yeah, it was quite a leap for her.
Oh, boy.
And
How did her family take all this? It was...
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I have a letter that I quote in my book that where she wrote to her father and said, you know, I don't know how. Please break this news to mother, but you know, I'm planning to go to China and marry. And my father wanted her to come over before they got married to see what it was like, in case she didn't like to, she wanted to back out of it. And at that time, things were still pretty rough in China. You know, they just had the communists that had the northern, no, it was before the Northern March. And but things were still unsettled, and he had, in the meantime, he had gotten a position. He had gone back to China and become a professor of I think he was head of the chemistry department at Shanghai College, which was a Baptist college from which he had graduated earlier. And
Well, yeah, that had to be quite a leap for her, because, you know, like today we've got the internet and computers, and you could instantly learn about this. I mean, it was probably going off to the unknown almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she lived over there very short while. We got married in April, and she went over, I think, around January or February, something like that. So that was, and then he got another job, this time with a company in Suzhou, and the big thing about that was that the man in Suzhou, the owner of the company, wanted him to find a way of making matches so that they wouldn't fall apart in Shanghai during the whole Yangtze Valley during the wet season. The match heads would collapse, and you couldn't strike them. So he experimented, and he found out that it was the glue that was the issue. And so he found a Swedish glue maker that would make glue that wouldn't fall apart during the wet season. And so that was his big claim to fame at that point. And then they moved up to Hankow with it, and he took a job with the government as the government inspected all the shipments of vegetable oil, tung oil and stuff like that came down the river. And he was known for his honesty and his integrity. And people would, sometimes a shipment would come in, and the owner would come to him and say, here, I'll give you some money, you test mine first. He said, I will test them in the order in which they arrived. I'll get to yours, even if I have to stay up all night to do it. And so they lived in Hankow, where I was born. My mother taught at a Chinese girls' school. She taught English. And I was born in 1930.
Wow. And then grew up there and started school and everything there?
No, we left there in 1930, must have been 31, early 32, and went down to Shanghai, moved to Shanghai. Still, I believe, with the government, where the government was setting up a new factory for processing vegetable oils. And so he became the manager of that. And so they were in Shanghai. From then, I was there until 1946.
And and this is where the story gets interesting. At this point now, the Japanese have invaded China, and
well, at that point in 1931, 32, they invaded Manchuria.
Right.
And so there was a lot of tensions going on. And then I came over here with my mother in 1934, and we visited my grandparents. We were here for about 4 months, and it was the height of the Depression at that point.
Yeah, right.
But my grandfather was the pastor of the Presbyterian Church in Stillwater, New Jersey, and also headmaster of a school, and in the best Scottish tradition, that was the way they did it in Scotland in those days, and we were over here, and I was. There was no talk about the Depression or anything like that. I'm not sure. I think it reached Stillwater when there would be sometimes hobos and people like that coming from New Jersey, or sometimes the crooks, hoodlums from New Jersey would hide out in the hills in New Jersey. Crooks from New York, but I was there, and my grandfather had 2 large German shepherds, which he kept there to ward off any intruders, And so we spent 4 months here, and we went to quite a bit of time in New York and Statue of Liberty and all that sort of thing.
Do you have memories of that trip at all, or?
A few.
Yeah,
A few.
yeah. And was there any concern about from your grandparents or your parents thinking, "Oh, geez, maybe you guys ought to stay here where it's safer than returning to China"?
No, they were at that point. At least if they were, I was
Yeah.
unaware of it.
Right.
And we went back to China, and it was quite peaceful at that point.
Oh, okay.
This was between the time they invaded Manchuria and the time they came into Shanghai. And so, and those were, as I write in my book, sort of halcyon years. My parents belonged to clubs, and they went horseback riding, and it was they were in a new house, and it was a good time for them.
Yeah, and probably a great childhood for you at that time.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. And then the wave comes. The Chinese move south and invade.
The Japanese came. Well, as it turns out, I found out only later after I was here and read some books by some people who were over there, and that the Chinese actually provoked the Japanese into attacking Shanghai because the German there was a German advisor to Chiang Kai-shek after World War One. It was I think his name was von Falkenhayn or something like that, and he advised Chiang Kai-shek, and he said at the time, the Japanese will eventually want to invade China, but they will come down from the north. They will follow the railroad tracks down from the north. And he said, you should provoke them into attacking from the east along the Yangtze River, because they can only go so far before they're stopped by the Yangtze gorges and all that sort of thing. And so that turns out is what happened. I think that the Chinese attacked the Japanese first. The Japanese had a contingent there, and then they started bombing Shanghai. My first recollection was my mother and I went down to. She had an office downtown Shanghai, and it was a Saturday, and she went into this was called the Chinese Quarterly. It was an English language quarterly publication, and we were heading downtown, and all of a sudden there was this huge boom in front of us, and all I can remember was smoke and dust coming up, and the buses stopped, and everybody got out of the bus and started running back away from the Bund. And so my mother grabbed me, and we took off and kept running until we got to the Park Hotel, which my uncle was manager of. My father's, one of his younger brothers was a manager of the Park Hotel. And we stopped there and watched this surge of humanity go past. And eventually things settled down, and we somehow got on a taxi or a bus and went back to where we lived. But it turned out that was a pretty bad day for Shanghai, because another bomb had hit the one of the department stores there, where there was a Rotary Club meeting on the second floor, and a good friend of ours was wounded. A lot of men were killed, and then there was also that was also the Japanese had hit a Chinese airplane had come in to bomb the ship in the harbor, the Japanese ship in the Hongpu harbor, and the Japanese hit it, and the guy came in, lost control, and crashed into the Great World, which was a big arcade with all kinds of, and it was filled with people on a Saturday, and so thousands of people were killed.
Wow. So now you're at war. Talk about those occupation years and what life was like and your memories of that.
Well, I have much more vivid memories of that.
Yeah.
We moved away from the edge of the city, which is where the fighting was. The fighting was pretty much confined to the area outside there. Shanghai was, at that time, there were two parts. There was a French concession and the international settlement. And the defining boundary was the railroad tracks went around the outside of the city. And we were too close to the boundary on the southwest side. So we moved inland about a couple of miles in, and we and some other friends of ours who were out in that area moved in and stayed in a school for a while, and then we moved back after a couple of months. But when we moved back, the whole place was deserted. It was everybody moved out. There was, I think we were one of the few families in this development that was that moved back in. Of course, while we were gone, we had servants, and servants still stayed there. But after we moved back, there was an incident. A burglary took place in our house one night, and there was, of course, we were surrounded by empty houses, and this guy came across and climbed up onto the second floor balcony, came through my room unknown to me, and went into my parents' room, and my mother woke up and said to her husband, her father, and said, "T.G., there's someone in here," and the guy was going through his pockets, in the dark, and she woke up, and so she started screaming, and the guy jumped up and ran out, and he ran out through my room, but the French door in the meantime had blown shut, and he ran through the glass and onto the balcony and jumped down, and she ran out on the balcony and threw bricks at him, but he got away. And but then that was when we decided to move permanently, and we moved into the French concession, which was much farther inland, and we were there then for the rest of the war. That was in late 37 until I left in 1948. Then my parents left in 49.
Wow. Well, how did that disrupt life? Did your father still maintain his job? I mean, what was daily life like?
Well, daily life was fairly complicated. I went to school inland in a school near what we called Bubbling Well Road, and I remember being there when the Japanese had their victory march after they conquered Shanghai, but they marched through the international settlement. And I remember watching that. I was in second grade at the time. second grade, yeah. And then we were in the French concession, and my parents enrolled me in a mission school, MacTier school, and we had sometimes we had rice lines. In my book, I have a picture. In fact, I've got the picture downstairs of my original painting, which I made when I was 9 years old, and this was time when rice was rationed, and we were a little bit struggled a little bit for food. Interestingly enough, ships were still coming in from outside,
Really?
and so there were two shops that catered to foreigners. One was called Tom Sing, which was near where we lived in the beginning, and then in the French concession, about 2 blocks down, was a place called Van Saint, and they had everything from Maxwell House coffee to all the stuff that we're used to, and so we would go over there and buy stuff, buy food, and my father left, and he left with the government. He dismantled his factory and shipped it to Hong Kong and then inland, and he followed it inland to Chongqing, where the company was set up again. And then he became head of the government. The government had a monopoly on matches, and so he was head of the match monopoly, and also some of the vegetable oil refining. And then, of course, in Chongqing, they were bombed, and he talks about running air raid shelters and all that.
Was that a period of time, were you separated, was he
We
able to?
were separated.
Yeah.
He left in sometime in 1938, and we didn't see him then for 3 years. He was in, and then in the meantime, my mother, to keep things going, she started a shop. She went into partnership with an American woman and her husband. Her husband was Chinese, and they set up the antique shop, curios, antiques, and touristy stuff like lace and those sort of things. So what you see around here are a lot of things from our shop.
Wow.
That somehow we managed to get out. And then in 1940, I think she took over the whole shop, and then my father came back for a visit. Hong Kong was still open then. Came through Hong Kong, came up to Shanghai, and that was 1940. And then he left and didn't come back until 44, I believe. Yeah, it was 44.
Now, as a government official, if the Japanese would have caught him, was he in?
Yeah, he came back as a, well, what happened was, fast forward a few years, our friends, good friends, the Wongs, they had a couple of dogs, and one of the dogs got rabies and died, but it had bitten the other dog, and the older dog got rabies. And I had come home from school one day, and I usually called over to the Wongs and said, well, can I come over and play and all that? And they were about, I don't know, 2 miles so from where I lived. I rode on my bicycle. My mother was in the shop, of course, and So I called over, and it turns out that one of the dogs had bitten one of my friends. They tried to catch the dog, and the dog, they eventually got it into a cage, but he got bitten on the hand. Well, anyway, we took care of the dog, took her to the vets, and I still remember seeing in the vets, they put a stick in to sort of agitate. The dog was frothing at the mouth and all that. Anyway, so my friend and he and his brother and I went over to the French. This was in the French concession, and we went to the French health center, and they cauterized it, and then after that, and I think they gave him a shot, and then about 3 weeks later, he showed symptoms of rabies.
Oh boy.
And so his father was a very well-known doctor, and he owned a hospital, owned 2 hospitals, in fact. And so they took him to the hospital, and in the meantime, we had been playing with him and been around him, and so he died shortly thereafter. And then everybody who had been in contact with him had to get the shots.
In the stomach?
In the stomach, yeah. And it was every day. And then one by one, the adults who were getting the shots started, first the doctor himself had I think he had an anaphylactic shock, so he couldn't take any more shots. My mother came down, she got she had some sort of a brain attack or something, and she had tremors and all that sort. So they stopped giving her shots, and she went over. The Wongs invited her to come and stay with them so they could look after her. So I was home alone.
Oh,
And then the thing is, we were supposed to get 20 shots, every day. We would gather at the Wongs. There were a whole crew of us getting the shots, and then someone discovered that these were double shots. They were, and they said, "Okay, after 10 days, you're done." So after 10 days, I was done.
Still 10 days of it.
Yeah, and then one evening, there was a knock on the door, and I went, and we never let anybody in the front door. We always had a side window. We looked out to see who was there. I looked out, and there's this kind of shabby-looking man and dressed in traditional Chinese clothes and all that. And I said, "Who are you? What do you want?" And he said, "Jim, I'm your father."
Oh.
And so we let him in. And my mother, of course, was over at the Wongs. So it was dark at that time. And he got a pedicab and got a ride over to the Wongs, and I rode my bike. And in the meantime, he had called and just tell my mother he was there, and he said, "This is your husband TG," and she fainted, on the telephone, and then Mrs. Wong came up and picked up the phone and said, "Who is this?" And he said, "This is TG," and she said, "Come over right away. Your wife has fainted."
Wow.
So we went over there, and things were okay. And then she came home, and
So he had come up incognito.
he had, and the thing that really scared him the most was he had in his luggage, he had some letters that my grandparents had sent him from America.
Wow.
And if the Japanese had gone through the luggage and found a letter from America, they would immediately arrested him. So he came over, and he was with us for about 4 months. And then we had friends, we had German friends. This is weird, this is Shanghai. Everybody knew everybody else. They were French, they were German, they were Norwegians, and all kinds of things, Chinese. And we had friends who were German, and their son-in-law was with the German secret police. And he said, called my mother, or called it his in-laws to tell my mother that the Japanese were beginning to close in on my father. And so he was with the Gestapo, and
Wow.
so my mother, so he immediately, changed his clothes and all that, and got on a train. My uncle got a train ticket for him, and he got on the train and left. And then when he got back halfway to Chongqing, the Japanese had mounted an invasion through there, and so he had to go the next several weeks through back roads and all that. Finally, after about a month, he got back to Chongqing.
Boy, and I would think to complicate things, with your mom giving up her citizenship, she had no protection from the U.S. government, would she?
No, well, it didn't matter at that point.
No.
They put all in 1943, they put all the Americans, or was it 42, 43, all the Americans that did not leave, they put them in concentration camps. She escaped that because she had a Chinese passport, and so that's how it was. And then, of course, then the bombings came, but this time it was Americans bombing, but they always bomb military targets, and things didn't really got tight. We had blackout curtains.
Oh,
We always had electricity rationing. We had water rationing, and all that kind of stuff.
Would you ever have any interaction with the Japanese troops? Would they harass you guys at all? No, okay.
No, but we were very careful. Toward the end of the war, after the Philippines were conquered, they set up an armed forces radio station, which we could receive, on a regular. You're not allowed to have shortwave radios, but a regular radio you could have. And so at night, after about 9 o'clock, you could pick up the armed forces radio station in the Philippines. And so we would then track the war that way. And that lasted until they finally gave up. That's how we heard about the bomb and all that.
Okay,
stuff.
right, yeah, wow, unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so now the war's over. What was post-war life like before, and then continue with your story then?
Well, the other thing is I also joined the Boy Scouts.
Oh.
And this was originally the British Scout Association. Then during the war, we finally we stopped wearing our uniforms because they thought that the Japanese would get upset if we saw us riding through the streets and all that.
Yeah.
And we trained first aid, and then after the war, things. In fact, I have a little medal that shows service during the war, and then of course all the troops came in, and my mother we were really busy. One ship came in from Korea. It was transiting Shanghai. They wouldn't let anybody off the troop ship because they were afraid once they let them go into Shanghai, they wouldn't come back. Well, in fact, I remember going downtown in the Bund, and there were at about 11 o'clock at night, and it was crowded with sailors, drunken sailors, trying to find their ships, trying to find the little launchers that would take them back to their ships. And and this one ship came in, and they wouldn't let anybody off. So they asked my mother if she would set up a shop in the ship. So we went out there, and we in the officer's wardroom, we laid out all the stuff on this table, and these guys, they were lined up all around the ship to come in and buy stuff, buy a souvenir from Shanghai.
Yeah. Wow.
So, then then there was a ship available to come over here in June, and it was a Liberty ship, and the crew quarters for the gun crew, they had a small gun crew on there that had been vacated, of course, and so they converted them. The officers' quarters, there were room for 3 people, and then there was the crew quarters, which were available. I think there were about a dozen. So they had a dozen men and 3 women, and somehow my mother managed to get on that. She and and we came back over here.
Just for a visit, or
For a visit.
Oh, okay.
And then she stayed on, and she didn't get her citizenship back until 47. No, let's say 46 we came back. And then, meantime, my uncle was a high school principal, and I went to his high school. This was in New Jersey. And my mother had her final court hearing in January, I think, of 47. Got her citizenship back. And then the plan was for me to go back with her. But things were getting bad in Shanghai. Things were, the students were having demonstrations in schools and rioting and all that kind of stuff. And my father said, well, he wrote and he said, Jim, you stay in America, finish your education, finish college, and then we'll see what happens. And then, so I did. And then in the meantime, the communists came in 49, and my parents left. My mother didn't leave right away. She left in the spring of 1950. My father went to Hong Kong. She stayed on, and she managed to get 12 crates of antiques, and there was a whole set of antique boxwood furniture and stuff like that. She got all that out, and the thing is, after the ship had pulled out of the harbor, someone said the customs people were looking for some American lady that had shipped out a bunch of stuff. Too late. Bye-bye. So she got to Hong Kong, and then my father he had been studying on agricultural products and learned that in Singapore and Malaysia, they were throwing away 65% of the pineapples. They would just cut out the core and then send the rest of the waste. And so he got a job over in Singapore setting up a company to make animal feed out of pineapple waste. And then she followed him over, set up her shop, in Singapore, a lot of her old suppliers had moved to Hong Kong, and so she set up her first shop with on consignment. They set all the stuff over on consignment, and then she finally got the business boomed. And
Wow. Now, what was your status at this time as far as citizenship?
my status was limbo because I was over 15, but under 21. So I couldn't get a citizenship on my own,
Oh,
and I was just sort of hanging there. And in the meantime, of course, I went to Cornell and joined ROTC there. ROTC in those days was mandatory for all
land grant.
all male students. So I went in for 2 years, and then they let me join the senior ROTC, and I was already well. I paid for my uniforms and stuff like that, and I graduated. I was one of the top 2 graduates of ROTC, and in the meantime, the Korean War had come on,
Oh,
and after I finished, well, they gave me a certificate of eligibility for a commission, and then I went to work for DuPont and
what'd you get your undergraduate degree in?
chemical engineering.
Oh, okay.
Interestingly enough, it was a 5-year program. Several years later, they had some kind of a faculty meeting and decided we should get masters. And so I've got downstairs a certificate that says you got a chemical Bachelor of Chemical Engineering, but now you have a Master of Engineering.
Oh, wow.
So, okay. So then, in the meantime, the draft board was breathing down my neck. I was at DuPont, and I actually met with my draft board. They were in New Jersey, Plainfield, New Jersey. I went up there and showed them my certificate of eligibility, told them my sad story, and also the other thing was, in the meantime, my uncle, who was involved a little bit in politics, had gone to my congressman, Cliff Case, in New Jersey, and he said, and told him my story and said, what I need is a permanent residence. So in those days, you could put a little rider on a bill. So there's a little sentence in there that says, allow Jim Ling to become a permanent resident. So then, once I was a permanent resident, I was eligible to become a citizen. But in New Jersey, at that time, there was a law that said no one could be naturalized until within 60 days of a general election. And New Jersey was having an election for a governor. So this was back in September. I got my, or July sometime, I got my permanent residence, but I couldn't get my couldn't be naturalized until the following year. So, this is weird. And anyway, in January, I went up to Newark, and I got naturalized. By the way, the naturalization back in those days, I had gone to this the naturalization office in Newark, and I talked to this guy who said, you're from China. Said it'll be the waiting list is 20 years long.
Oh.
For people from China to get
Oh, geez.
citizenship, because it was only a quote of like 120 a year. You know, even after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I said, well, okay, and then 6 months later, I've got my residence. You know, so I had to take the immigration exam. So I go in, and it's the same guy. He says, it's you again. There was this old Italian lady in front of me, and she had been here for 20 years. She was getting naturalized. And so he said, the this is a test in those days. So he said, asks her, who's the first president of the United States? And she says, George Washington. And he says, right. He says, what was the other question? He says, when is Independence Day? She gives him a blank look. He says, you know, we shoot off firecrackers, we celebrate. And she says, oh, the 4th of July. He says, good, you're good to go. Then it's me. It's you again. And he says, okay, what are the 3 branches of government? Okay, easy question. You know, he's got executive, legislative, and judicial. And he said, can one branch overrule the other? And I said, I'd been just in the middle of a course on constitutional law. So I said, sure, you know, the judicial branch can overrule the congressional, the legislative branch. And he said, okay, give me an example. And I knew it right away. I said, you know, Jones versus Smith, 1938, blah, blah, blah. He says, oh, okay, you're passed. So then I went down and got naturalized in Newark, went to Mitchell Field on Long Island, and got my commission, and was commissioned in Delaware, and in June I was on active duty.
Oh, jeez. And that was, what year was that?
1940. No, this was 54.
Okay, so the Korean War had ended by then. Okay,
It
good.
had.
Yeah.
And
Now, of all the branches, how did you decide to go Air Force?
well, goes back to the war days. When I saw those B-29s going overhead, I said, someday I'm going to be up there, not
Really?
down here.
Wow.
So I followed through on that, and I went on active duty. And I have a long line, by the way, of people who served in the military.
And what we'll do at the interview, we'll go through that and have you describe all your pictures and
Okay.
such. So you
How
want
much time do we have? We've already used up 40 minutes.
Oh no, I got 3 hours to take.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you went on active duty, and where'd you do your had you done all your basic and all that?
Well, I went in to come in. You had to go through some sort of indoctrination camp. It was up in upstate New York. It's closed now. I don't even remember the name of it. But spent about 4 weeks there, and then went to pilot training. And washed out of pilot training. That was my one big failure in life. I brought in a Piper Cub a little too high. I tried to land it from 15 feet, and it went.
Uh-oh.
And the landing gear bent. And at that time, the Korean War was over. They didn't need pilots, so they were trying to wash out as many as they could.
Sure.
So they sent me to navigator school, and I went to Harlingen, Texas.
Okay.
Harlingen was an interesting story in itself, in that the Rio Grande Valley had been hit by a hard freeze early in the late 40s or so, and wiped out all the citrus farms. And Lyndon Johnson, I think he was a congressman at the time, created this base, or resurrected this base, so that it would bring money into the valley, Rio Grande Valley. So for about 10 years, Harlingen was a navigator trading base. So I went down there and finished first in my class and was able to choose my assignment. So the way they did it then was we all sat in a room and they had all the assignments up on the board, and I picked Air Transport Squadron in Kelly Air Force Base, because I wanted to see the world. I didn't want to.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the choices at that time were SAC or some other, who wants this fly B-47s around and just go back to the same place.
Yeah.
So I wanted to see the world. So I joined the Air Transport Squadron at Kelly. And was there for almost 3 years.
Flying as a navigator.
As a navigator.
Yeah.
And had some interesting experiences there. One experience I had was we were flying to, we flew into lodges in Azores because you couldn't get all the way across in a C-54. And we took off from Dover, and about halfway across the ocean, I saw some smoke coming out of the junction box behind me, and I called the flight engineer and said, "What's going on there?" And he pulls it open and everything's burning up. And so we shut off all the electricity. So then the only thing they had was a little hand crank radio. And so we got permission to deviate to Bermuda. And in the meantime, the only way we had to navigate was with a compass and the stars.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, I had another navigator with me. I said, I will do all the hard stuff, the calculations. You take the shots and call them down to me. And so I did all the calculations, and I said, okay, get up, take a shot of this. And he got up and he said, I can't see anything. I said, oh my God, the clear sky. So I got up, I said, okay, now you write down what I tell you, and I took all the shots. Anyhow, we navigated, we got into Bermuda, and it turned out that in the previous maintenance scheduling, they had somehow reversed the wiring in the pressure transmitter in number 4 engine, and it had taken all that time to work its way back through the system until it shorted out the main circuit.
Huh. Wow. But you're able to bring him on into Bermuda with no problem.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. Now, you would eventually go on and make it your career. Was that always the idea, or did that develop over time that, hey, I think I'll just make it a career?
Well, no, I thought, well, if I like it, I'll stay on. And so at that time, my roommates were all ROTC graduates, and they had their 3-year commitment, and the 2 years was up, and so they all left. And I took a regular commission and stayed on. And that brings up another interesting story. I was in the squadron then at the end of, it was 56, 54, 55, I think it was the end of 56 or 57. The squadron was disbanded at Kelly. They went out of business, and we were all scattered to the four winds. I was sent to finish. I had 6 months left before I had to go on to my next assignment, and we were flying a C-124. I had just arrived at Donaldson, and we had a meeting. We used to, the navigators would get together for coffee in the morning, and it turned out that the commander was sending we were responsible for the base down in Antarctica, and he said my ice was getting ready to melt down there. This was in the Antarctic. Summer was beginning to show up, and he said we better send some spare engines down there so that they'll be able to, in case one of them gets stuck. And so we loaded 4 engines on this C-124 and flew down to New Zealand, which is where our base was. And we got down there okay, but when we arrived, they said, "What are you guys doing here?" We said, "Well, we were sent down here because we thought that you needed extra engines." And they said, "No, we're standing down for Christmas. Everybody's going home." So we said, "Okay," and it was close to the day before Christmas Eve or something like that. So we parked there. There was a New Zealand Air Force base, and we stayed in a squad tent there. There were 5 officers. I think we had three pilots and 2 navigators. So we all stayed in this squad tent, and the next morning, Christmas Day, we were going to have Christmas dinner, and we went into the officers' mess. There was nobody else there. Little officers' mess. We went in, and the cook, came running out of the kitchen and said, "There's a guy in here who is going berserk. He's waving a knife and he's charging one of the other kitchen workers around the kitchen with a knife." And so we went out there, and there was this guy holding this knife, and he'd been drinking. We were all from South Carolina at the time, and he had called home, and somehow there was bad connection, and he wasn't able to get home. He started drinking, and he just went crazy.
Yeah.
So the aircraft commander, who was a senior officer, came out and told the guy that was being chased, he said, get back in there, get back in behind us. And then he said to the guy with the knife, he says, "Put it down." And the guy threw the knife away.
Oh, wow.
And then by then the security police had shown up and hauled him off. But so then the next day, Boxing Day down there, we had a big, for the locals, we had a show. They'd never seen a C-124 before, so we showed them the inside of the 124. So then, since they didn't need the engines, we flew back.
So you never made it to Antarctica?
Never made it to Antarctica, yeah. Although I think I was eligible for somehow the Antarctic ribbon or something. Anyhow, I never applied for that. We go back to Fiji, and which was our next stop. and stayed overnight. And the next day we took off, lost an engine,
Oh,
and we had to turn back and land again at Fiji. So then frantically called all over the world, who could come down and with a rescue crew and install one of these engines. And then we got a call from New Zealand saying, well, we're all standing down, and our whole crew is going back to South Carolina. We'll just send the maintenance crew up, and they can do it. So they did, and we got on and flew all the way back to South Carolina. A few stops in between,
yeah.
Hawaii and San Francisco and all that. But we went back with three engines, two engines of the ones we originally took down. One of them being on the airplane, and the crew that put it on came back with us, and I always felt that was the safest that I'd ever felt because I figured nothing would go wrong.
Yeah, right. Now, traveling all over and being roughly in that part of the world, were your parents still in Singapore at that time? Or?
They were. They were in Singapore.
Any of your assignments get you?
Vietnam, but that's later.
Yeah.
Okay, so I had applied in the meantime for graduate school, and I got a word from the Air Force to report to Iowa State for a master's program in nuclear engineering, which I did. I went to navigator school there, and in the meantime, during these school assignments, I flew a lot with the Navy. Navy would provide an airplane for their students, and I would just ride along as a navigator, just getting airtime. And so I went to. I was there for a year and a half, got a master's, and then got assigned to the Army Nuclear Power Program, which was stationed at the Atomic Energy Commission headquarters in Germantown, Maryland. And
did you have to transfer service branches, or were you still Air Force?
Still Air Force.
Okay.
I was in the Air Force detachment with the Army Nuclear Power Program.
Okay.
But we were there because at the time they were thinking of putting a little nuclear power plant to power the radar stations we had, the DEW line, distance early warning line across the northern tier, and so I was project engineer for a gas-cooled nuclear power program.
Wow.
And we had a thing called the gas-cooled reactor experiment out in Idaho at the nuclear test site. And the one interesting thing about that assignment was that it was right after New Year's, and when Kennedy was inaugurated, what was it? It was 62, and just before the Kennedy inauguration, the plant there were two small nuclear test plants, and they were separated by a quarter of a mile maybe, and the one next to us blew up. And this is not well known. It was covered up. 3 enlisted men died. What happened was to keep the thing from going what they call prompt critical, they poison down the core, and so when you let the control rods down, the thing wouldn't blow up on you, and and they had been doing maintenance on it, and unbeknownst to them, the strips of boron aldehyde on the control rods had been falling off, and to the point where it was estimated that if you lifted the control rods off the bottom of the reactor by 6 inches, it would go prompt critical.
Oh, jeez.
And what happened was these 3 enlisted men were in the plant. It was in the middle of the night, and the guy got up on top of the reactor to hook in. It had the lifting mechanism was up there. They faked it to lift it up. He went down, lifted it, went past 6 inches, and the thing went boom. So all 3 of them were killed. But then there was huge amount of radiation inside that thing. But interestingly enough, it was pretty much attenuated by the steel core, the steel shell of the building. But I was sent up there after that about 3 days later to check out, make sure that nothing had happened with ours. And then in the end, they built a prototype of ours, and it sprang a leak, and they just dug a big hole, buried it in the Idaho desert.
Really? Huh.
And then, from there I went to Command and Staff College in Montgomery. Command and Staff, I went to, I had applied to graduate school again, and the Air Force sent me to Stanford for get a PhD. And while at Stanford, of course, by then I was married with 2 kids, and we got a little house in Sunnyvale, and I got my flying time in mainly with the Navy, since Moffett Naval Base was nearby, and I could go over there, and my flying partners, interestingly enough, were Admiral Kinnear, who was at that time a commander, and he was he and some of the other Navy guys they'd go out on a Friday night, since nobody on base wanted to go fly on Friday nights. We would always get an airplane and tool up and down the bay for about 4 hours in a C-45. And but he, interestingly enough, he eventually retired as a 4-star admiral. But at Stanford one day, I walked into the office of the industrial engineering, and the guys were all there filling out papers. And I said, "What are you doing?" These are, a lot of them were officers, you know. And, in fact, they were all officers, and in the program. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well," they said, "You fill this piece of paper out, and you can get a master's degree." And so I filled it out, and sure enough, a couple months later, I got a Master of Industrial Engineering.
So this is your third master's
My
there?
third master's, yeah.
Wow.
And I went on, and fortunately, Stanford had a program which allowed if you got faculty from more than one department, you could name your own program. If they would sponsor you, you could name your own program and call it whatever you wanted. So I called mine Nuclear Resource Management, because I was taking management courses in the business school, and I was taking nuclear engineering courses, and so I graduated with that. And from there, I went to the Joint Staff as a what did they call it? A special scientist or something like that.
The Joint Staff at
the
Pentagon?
Pentagon, yeah,
Ah,
Joint Staff.
Jeez.
And I was on the, they had at that time the Special Assistant for Strategic Mobility, SASM. And this was right around the time when we were doing a lot of deployments, and there, the McNamara was there, and he was interested in strategic deployments, and so they set up this Special Assistant for Strategic Mobility, and I was in that group, and they had a bunch of young PhDs there, and the big my big contribution there was that they were doing calculations using computer programming to calculate a number of sorties you required to deploy a unit. And for some reason, the number of sorties calculated by the model were always less than were actually used. And so I said, well, let's go out and see what they're doing out in the field. I came out here to Peterson and watched them load for, I think it was this was at the time, they were loading for the Vietnam War, and I think it was a 4th Division or something. And I realized that what every loadmaster knew, that the limitation was the cube, the size of the cube on the airplane, rather than the weight. The computers were always based on weight. You know, you could carry, 150 tons or 100 tons or whatever, and the only thing you could ever do with that was maybe load a tank on it, but everything else, a truck, for example, is extremely weightless because you can load the truck bed, but underneath it's empty, and they don't stuff things underneath. So it was basically cube limited. So we then from that developed the Lockheed was doing one of the contractors, and they developed the Lockheed loading model, which and that was my main contribution. Then from there, let's see, that was, got my PhD in 67, so then in 70, I was sent over to Vietnam as I was the chief of the Combat Analysis Division at 7th Air Force Headquarters. And
what that entail?
That entailed primarily monitoring truck kills on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And because we had a network of sensors along the trail, and so we could monitor the truck traffic along. And my big contribution there was that there were more trucks killed being recorded than as the PACAF intelligence told us had been shipped into the port of Hanoi. So we figured something was wrong with our accounting system. So General Clay, who was chief of the 7th Air Force at the time, said, let's set up an experiment. He said, let's lay out a bunch of trucks on a simulated Ho Chi Minh Trail in Bien Hoa. And he said, can you get a bunch out of uh, out of the scrap truck place to be put them along there. So we did, and had the gunship come in and shoot at them with 30 millimeter and 40 millimeters. And it turned out that only the trucks that were carrying ammunition or POL, petroleum and oil, were totally destroyed. The others, if you shot at them with a 30 millimeter, the truck is an amazingly strong thing, and if you just punch holes in it, and they'd punch holes in the tires, but then you could just jump in and drive them off. So we revised the kill criteria for trucks, but also out of that came we needed a bigger ordnance. So that was a time when they decided to put the 105 on the gunship. That was near the end of my tour. I wasn't there when they actually fired, but if you hit a truck with a 105, it's toast. And so that was my contribution there.
Where were you based in Vietnam?
At Tan Son Nhut.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And my family, in the meantime,
Right.
had gone over to Singapore to visit my parents. I had a daughter at that time. She was 2 years old. My kids are I think probably very few that were actually in Vietnam and actually got on the base.
Wow.
And saw my hooch, and my sons were fascinated by this. I had a steel helmet and flak vest and all that stuff in there. And they had a several-hour layover, so I drove the Jeep out there to pick them up. They got to ride in the Jeep back and visit my hooch and so forth. And then during Christmas that year, I took leave and went over to Singapore, and we went up to Cameron Highlands, where my parents had a cottage, a vacant cottage with a pretty big house. And fortunately, what was the problem there? Something happened with the airline. I flew Air Vietnam from Saigon to Singapore, and they had canceled a flight. They were unreliable. They were always canceling flights.
Right.
And they called me in Cameron Highlands and said, your flight has been canceled. I was going to leave. I was going to stay at Christmas, over Christmas, and leave the next day. And they said, your flight has been canceled, and you'd have to go back to Singapore. So I left the day before Christmas.
Oh.
And fortunately, they had a huge rainstorm, washed out all the roads, so that I wouldn't have been able to get back if I had followed my original schedule. But I flew back to Singapore and got back to Saigon okay. The interesting thing is people ask me, they'll say, well, we should never have been in Vietnam, and all that sort of thing. And I said, I'm always reminded of this circumnavigators club that my father belonged to, and he, before I left to come home, I took one last trip over to Singapore, and he invited me to come to lunch with him, the circumnavigators club. The guy sitting next to me, asking me about how the war was going and all that. And by the way, speaking of war, I digress for a minute. My father would go over to Saigon periodically because he supplied feed and to some chicken farmer in Saigon, and he stopped by my office one time, and my commander, Colonel Anderson, said, "What do people think in Singapore? What do they think about bombing of Hanoi?" This was before they turned it off. This was and this was in 78, no, 68 when they turned off the bombing. And my father said, "You should never stop bombing. You should have kept going
Really?
while
Huh.
you were
Interesting.
while you were ahead." Anyway, fast forward 3 years later, I'm in the Circumnavigators Club, and this man sitting next to me said, "You know, when you go home, they will never appreciate what you did." But he said, "We do here."
Really?
And I always thought that was interesting because if you think back on the domino theory,
Yeah, right.
and people say, nowadays they say, it never happened and all that. It was true. It was the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese were coming south. The communists were about to take over Indonesia. There was a communist, they were still hiding out in the jungle in Malaysia. There was Cambodia and all those places were all ready to go communist. And when we went in, we stopped all that. The Indonesians turned around, Philippines, all that. So it was worth it, And anyhow, that
How do you feel after 50 years that now that we've had a chance to dissect it and chew on it? Do you still believe that? And had your thoughts that deviated at all involving the Vietnam War?
No.
Okay.
And like I say, I agree with my father. He shouldn't have never stopped bombing Hanoi in 1968.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I came back with my family, and where was I stationed? Well, then I went to War College. I got my assignment to the Naval War College in 1971. So I went there to Newport, and that was a very nice interlude.
And you taught there?
No, I was a student.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Jeez. Yeah.
I spent something like 11 of 21 years in school, one school or another. And are they still on? Yeah. And I was asked if I would head up a study. Before I left Vietnam, a guy I knew who had been in the on the Joint Staff with me and in the Army nuclear program with me, an Army colonel, and he had just been assigned to Vietnam. And I called him up, and he had been to the Naval War College. So I said, "Any advice for me in the Naval War College?" He said, "Yes, learn how to sail and don't do a group study." Because if you do a group study, he said, come May, when all the rest of the guys are out on the golf course, he said, you'll still be in there hassling with your group trying to straighten out the study report. And I said, so I followed his advice. I learned how to sail, but I didn't follow his advice of group study, because the group study, the Air Force advisor at the War College came to me and said, would you be willing to hit up a combined group from the Staff College and the War College? We had 2 guys from the Staff College and 3, I think, from the War College to study the future of the Navy. This was a a request from Zumwalt that had just become the CNO. He wanted a fresh look at the future of the Navy.
Wow.
So they said, how about having an unbiased Air Force guy be the project leader? I said, well, I can't turn that down.
Yeah.
So I headed up this project on the future of the Navy. And it's true enough, after I learned how to sail and all that, come May, and the guys were all out on the golf course, and I was down, trying to tie up the loose ends and go down to Washington to brief the CNO and all that stuff. So,
Wow. Do you remember some of your thoughts in that report, and how they compared to how the future of the Navy?
they didn't follow what we recommended.
Oh, really?
We concluded that the future was in numbers, and that we would be better off to have a large number of small carriers. Still, the Navy was dominated at that point by carrier admirals. Small number of small carriers rather than a large number of super carriers, because the super carriers were worth about 2% of the GDP each. And he said, if with the number of small carriers, it would give you some wiggle room if you were in a war or some incident happened and they took out one of the carriers or two of them. It was not a casus bellum, not a cause for war, but negotiation or whatever. But if they took out a super carrier and you saw 2% of your GDP hit the bottom, you couldn't ignore that.
Yeah. Right.
So that was our reasoning, but the Navy never did. And interestingly enough, I recently talked to a friend of mine who's had been a submarine squadron commander, and he said he feels that the Navy would be better off with nuclear submarines. He said you can build 5 of them for 1 nuke, and he said you'd be better off having 5 nuclear submarines than us. And he said you could build them a lot faster. And anyway. So then I finished War College as a distinguished graduate. And my parents were over here then. They came over to my graduation. So that was the only graduation they ever went to when I finished War College. And then I got probably the worst assignment I ever had. I got assigned to the special assistant for nuclear power or nuclear weapons at the War College at the Pentagon, and that was an unfortunate assignment. And I got out of that in about 2 years when the Arab oil embargo happened, and they were looking for people to man the special task group for, it was called the Defense Energy Task Group. And the head of that was a man that I had, whose name I remembered, was Admiral Sonnenschein, Nathan Sonnenschein. And he had been the project officer for the fast logistic transport back in the day when I was doing the strategic mobility stuff. And he was the project officer for the fast logistic transport. And because at that point, McNamara's WizKids had done their modeling, and they had decided that the cheaper way to go was to build fast ships, which are cheaper than building more airplanes. And they were at odds with the Joint Staff on that. Anyway, Animal Sunshine asked me if I would join the team, and I said sure. So for the next 4 or 5 months, we studied all aspects of the defense energy and went around, visited different bases and wrote a report. And then after he retired, I decided to retire. I thought I was eligible at the time, and I could, so I decided to retire.
And you said 21 years?
21 years.
Wow.
As a colonel.
Well, let's talk post-military life then. Where'd you go? Take your story from there.
Okay, from after I retired, I'd been working with the MITRE Corporation, and they offered me a job as a group leader there. So I went there, and that kind of led into some other things that we had done for the National Science Foundation, a study of, they wanted a study of federal laboratories. So we did a study on that and wrote a report on that. And then the DOE, then they stood up the DOE, Department of Energy, and I was offered an opportunity to join the senior executive service, which was paying more than I was getting paid at MITRE. So I left MITRE and joined the and went back to went back in the government and was in charge of laboratory policy at the DOE for a while. And then the White House Energy Office, no, White House Energy, the White House Science Office decided to do a study of federal laboratories. And so a friend of mine who was over there asked if I would come over, and since I was a logical person, had visited all the DOE laboratories. And so I went over, and the head of the study group was jeez, I'm getting bad at names. I shouldn't. Dave Packard. How can I forget? Dave Packard, and I was executive secretary for the group that studied federal laboratories.
Dave Packard of Hewlett and Packard?
Yes.
Okay.
So I worked with them on that, and they were, at the end of the study, these guys were all sort of fumbling around. Nobody had written a study before, and the guy who was in charge of it was not very well organized, and then I remember one of the best compliments I ever had was Dave Packard saying to me, "Jim, I'm sure glad you were on this project because you could write a coherent report." And so I did. He asked me to put it together, and we wrote our report, and then what was the next project? Well, then I was still at DOE at the time, and then on assignment to the White House.
To the White House.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
because this was under the White House
Oh, right.
aegis, you know, and so then I started my own company for a while. That only lasted a couple of years. I was
A consulting
trying to,
type.
Yeah, well, we were consultants to try to bring federal research into the private sector, but that didn't work out, and so I went back in the government again. They and I was there for a couple of years, and then I left. And then I went to MIT. MIT was doing a study. I was always involved in these studies. They were doing the Lean Aircraft Initiative, and they're trying to bring basically the Toyota manufacturing system into the U.S. and into the aerospace industry. And so I was a part of that. I was in charge of the inventory group. And the interesting thing about that was that Boeing refused to join. They wouldn't join the group. It was an collaborative industry and government study, and Boeing refused to join because they said that they would give up their industrial secrets. And it turned out we had a graduate student who had spent the summer at Boeing, and he came back and told us, he said, their industrial secrets are how inefficient they are. And, you know, that didn't catch up with them until 30 years later. But
Right.
we knew all along that their whole system was messed up. It was, so that eventually the chickens came home to roost, and so we turned out a small study, and then Shelly moved to. She was in. I was following her around. She was in Hanscom at the time, Hanscom Air Force Base, and we lived in base housing. We had a little what do you call it? Anyway, it was a small house on base, and then she moved. She was sent to command and staff, so we moved down to Montgomery, and then from there she was sent to San Jose. And we moved to San Jose, and from then on, that was the end of my career.
Yeah. Wow, what an amazing career. Wow. And then,
By the way, when she was in San Jose, I went to visit an old friend of mine, Edward Teller, the father of the H-bomb, and I had run into him back when we were doing studies on the federal labs, at the DOE labs, when I was in MITRE, and ran into him again when we were studying federal labs. So I went to Edward Teller. Edward was he was a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution, and he wrote me a letter of recommendation. So I became a visiting scholar at Hoover Institution for 3 years.
wow.
And, I didn't write any studies there.
Wow. Now, how did you and Shelly meet?
We met at when unfortunately I got divorced in the 70s, and she was on the Prackett Commission. She was assigned there, and As, and that's how we met,
Yeah.
70s.
Oh, fascinating. Well, let's talk. We'll slowly start to wind down this interview. Talk a little bit about family. You know, you what 2 children from your first marriage, and you've got a daughter from this marriage, and any grandchildren?
No
Yep.
grandchildren.
Yeah.
I'm the only 84-year-old guy with no grandchildren. Yeah, grandchildren, yes, but no great-grandchildren.
Yeah. Yeah. How many grandchildren do you have?
9.
9.
Yes.
And how did you guys end up here in Fort Collins?
Well, that's she and I debate this, but she said she had moved here. Well, we knew people from the church in San Jose who would come here, and they liked it here, and so I said I'll take a look at Fort Collins, and also Fort Collins at that time, and Money magazine had Fort Collins had a story. No, it was a Money magazine, something else, on best places to raise
Yeah.
kids and best places to retire to, and the two intersected at Fort Collins. So I said, well, let's try Fort Collins, and she said, I'll go if you let me design and build my own house. So we looked into this, and we bought this land. This was all cornfield.
Yeah. Right.
And bought this piece of land, and we consulted. We had a committee build the house, had a realtor, and a builder, and us, and put the house together. And been here ever since.
Wow.
Came here in 1921, I believe. Yeah.
Is this probably the longest place you've ever stayed in your career?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. And the same with her.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Well, as we wind down the story, I'm sure we only got the tip of the iceberg of your story. Is there anything else that I didn't ask you, or any of those stories that have kind of floated to the top that you wanted to add to this? Or do you think, by and large, we rounded out, we got primarily the story?
I think you got most of it, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, the question I always like to ask towards the end, as you look back on your military career, and it's pretty evident, I can't even really ask this question, because usually it's that period of your time, but how do you think that affected your life? Obviously it was a major component of your life. If you hadn't gone in the military, what do you think your trajectory would have changed at all? Or would you have been a very highly educated man? I imagine you would have stayed in education, or
Well, I stayed on in industry or something like that.
yeah.
But no, I have no regrets.
Yeah.
And in fact, I sometimes think maybe I should have stayed on longer. Some people thought I should have waited until I made general and all that. But, you know,
And what rank did you retire at?
Colonel.
Colonel.
Yeah. I made colonel at 18 years, which was pretty much my goal. I said if I had made around anywhere after 15, I would have gone for general. But at 21, I moved my family around enough, and some of my friends who were general officers said, "Oh, you should have gone to Wright Pat or someplace, and you could have made general out of there." And I said, "No, I moved my family around too much. I'm just ready to settle down."
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, Jim, I want to thank you for sharing your incredible story to date. An amazing story as far as I'm concerned, and I want to thank you for your time. But just as important, I want to thank you for your service to our country.
Oh, you're welcome. This is my great-grandfather, Julius Amos Baylor, and I sort of was inspired by his story. He was Civil War corporal, fought for 4 years, and he was inspiration for me to join the military.
Is that right? Wow.
This is my grandfather, and this is taken much later. He was in World War I as a chaplain. He was 40 when he went in, and this is obviously taken when he was older. But he was an inspiration for me too.
And this is a letter from King George?
Yes,
Wow.
that's a letter from King George welcoming the American troops when they arrived in England. This is the medal I got for serving in the Boy Scouts during World War II.
Wow.
It was handed out to us after the war. The commissioner, Commissioner Gordon was his name. He had been in concentration camp. When he came out, he had all these medals made for those of us who kept scouting alive during the war. Oh, this is my graduation picture from when I graduated from nav school in 1955. And my mother always kept it on her desk.
Wow. Very nice.